Preston Manning, thank you very much for sitting down with us today.
Okay, well,
Appreciate
thank you.
it. Congratulations on the newly announced Eco-Fiscal Commission.
Oh, yes.
That was just announced. Maybe can you explain a little bit about what that is?
Well, it's a group of 9 economists who are going to dedicate themselves for the next number of years to trying to integrate economic development with environmental conservation. Like, a lot of discussion on this has been polarized. You're either for one or the other. I think a lot of people are coming to the conclusion you have to have both. You want a strong economy and you want a healthy environment. And now the question is, how do you get that? And these economists are going to work on that issue. And there's an advisory group that are going to give advice to them. It's a cross-party, cross-partisan groups, because they want to come up with practical solutions that political people will actually embrace and try to sell to the public. So I'm on this advisory group, but I'm quite optimistic about what these economists can achieve.
Is there any funding? Where does funding
yes,
come from? Yes,
they've got funding from about 5 or 6 foundations, family foundations, a couple of companies, but they are really independent. They're not getting money from any government or political party, and so hopefully their judgments will be respected.
Okay. You spoke to the conference about ethics in government, and you talk about the importance of ethical leaders in shaping an ethical culture within an organization. Can you explain that a little bit?
Well, as I told the students, when I was younger and I was in the management consulting business, I didn't believe that 1 or 2 people in a huge organization could actually affect its culture or its ethics. But my experience has been that yes, they can. In fact, that the ethical tone of a big organization tends to be set by a few people at the top. If they have high ethical standards and people know that they do have, and the people down below know they're going to be judged on whether they adhere to those standards or not, that makes a difference.
Can you give me an example?
Well, I can give more examples on the negatives. Well, I can give you a positive example, and I may be biased, but I learned a lot from it. My father was Premier of Alberta, but he used to give a little, some people would say a sermon to his MLAs and cabinet ministers and senior civil servants about once a year, saying that those of us who make the laws and those of us who administer the laws had better keep the laws, or we lose our moral authority to govern. And he had a couple of people in the Attorney General Department that were assigned to watch whether that rule was adhered to. And I think just the fact that and this is a pretty basic rule, it's the rule of law. We're making laws, we better keep the laws. But there are laws dealing with fraud, there's laws dealing with how you handle money that you hold in trust. And I think that set a tone for his administration that worked its way down to the lower levels. On the negative side, one of the worrisome things from the Gomery inquiry into the sponsorship scandal, because people asked, apparently were dozens and dozens of people knew that there was something wrong was going on, but they didn't report it, they didn't call the police, they didn't send something to the media or the opposition. And what I think Gomery found out was these people actually believed they were doing the right thing. The message they got from on high was, do whatever you have to do to stop these separatists. Now I'm sure it wasn't said, and the end justifies the means. I'm sure it wasn't said that way, but it was implied, do what you have to do. And that was a case where then some people crossed the line and actually thought they were doing the right thing.
Mm-hmm. You also mentioned, I wonder if you can tell the story of what your father used to do. With what he used to say about with the cabinet minister every couple of years. What was that?
Well, if you were going to adhere to these standards, you had to catch somebody every so often to prove that you were actually watching. So he would, and he wouldn't deliberately go looking for it, but every few years there would be somebody that would step out of line, and they would be disciplined as much to send a message to the others that someone is looking at this. And he would argue, if we don't discipline ourselves, we will be disciplined by others. We'll be disciplined by the electorate. So if you can't govern yourself, how are you qualified to govern others?
You're one who's dealt with the media a lot. So how do you see the media's role in this? Well, and can you maybe give some examples?
Yeah, well, I think the media can play a huge role in helping to hold political people to account. today, not just the regular media, but the social media. I say to aspiring candidates in that today you must assume that there is no such thing as a private meeting. And if your internal persona, how you treat the people in your office, how you treat your volunteers in your own little group, if your internal persona is different than the persona you present to the public, today someone will find that out. A volunteer with a cell phone and a camera can get that to you swearing at your own people or saying what idiots the voters are. They'll get it on it, and it'll be on YouTube tonight. And so what you are internally and in private better line up with what your public profession is, and that's a one case where if not the social media, at least handheld devices are probably making it harder for politicians to have two different personalities. One of the most disturbing things, this was before your time, but Richard Nixon used to be able to present a very presentable external image as the President of the United States, and when the tapes came out of how he talked about people, even his own people internally, some of his strongest supporters were shocked. The internal person didn't match the external to his detriment.
And how good a job does the media do in upholding ethics?
Well, I think the media have to. One of the problems if you're trying to advocate ethical standards is are you being hypocritical? Somebody will say, okay, you advocate this standard for that person, do you practice it yourself? And if you don't practice it yourself, then the worst charge that can be given against a moralist is you're hypocritical. You tell other people to adhere to that standard, but you don't adhere to it yourself. And I think that's why the media has to watch. If it's going to be a guardian or a watchdog and comment on the ethics of others, it has to be careful about its own ethics. And I used the illustration of the Mike Duffy case. Mike Duffy spent far more years in the press gallery than he ever did in the Senate. I think he learned a lot of his ethics there. And the press gallery constitution actually has a provision for disciplining. It's the only provision in its constitution that deals with ethics. It says if a member uses his position for a purpose other than journalism, then there should be a meeting that should be investigated, and if they've actually done that, they should be expelled from the gallery. Well, this particular individual used his position as a journalist, used the facilities of the gallery to lobby for a federal appointment.
Mike Duffy.
Which is a purpose other than journalism. And ideally, the gallery should have disciplined Mike. And if they'd done that, I doubt whether he would have got a federal appointment from the Liberals or the Conservatives. So it's just a caution that if you're going to be a watchdog on the ethics of others, you better make sure your own ethics are above board.
Right. And how do you see the various, I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit, how do you see the ethical behavior of the premiers of Canada and the Prime Minister?
Well,
how do you rate them?
Ryerson has done a recent survey. There's quite a few surveys on this subject. Our own Manning Centre does these annual surveys asking Canadians, where do you think the political class is strong? Where do you think they're weak? Where do you think, we look at Conservatives particularly, where do you think Conservatives are strong, very weak? And our data and Ryerson's data is the same. People have a low opinion of the ethics of political people. A vast majority of them think politicians are not honest in their communications, that they're far more interested in personal gain and their own advancement than they are serving the interests of the constituents. In fact, I think that's one of the reasons behind this conference, that people have such a negative view of parties, politicians, candidates, even elections, democratic institutions, that it's part of the explanation for why there's less and less participation in elections. People just say plague on all their houses. Just the American Senate elections, midterm elections reflected that. The most significant thing about it was the low turnout, the numbers of people who just said, I don't want anything to do with any of them. And that's rooted in these negative perceptions of the ethics or lack of ethics of the political class, which is why there's been these conferences. What can we do to strengthen those ethics?
There's been a lot said about our democratic institutions have been sort of under attack. Mr. Harper has been criticized for some of the things he's brought in, and the way he has maybe not used committees, things like that. So maybe making it said Canada a little less democratic or a lot less democratic. What's your opinion on that?
Well, I don't want to comment on the ethics of individual politicians.
I'm asking you more about what is the state of our democratic system right now?
Well,
is it worrisome
I think
or not?
it's suffering from this negative perception by the public. And what's partly reinforcing this excessive discipline on the part of various parties is if one member goes offside on something, this will be amplified sky high and do damage to the party, to do damage to all the other members. You take the Mike Duffy case. I mean, the Senate has been tarnished by this. There are dozens of senators who faithfully go to these committee meetings, yes, who faithfully fill out these expense forms, who try to do it right, and they do. But of course, there's no, you can't name them hardly. But one of them goes rogue and it discredits the institution. And that has a tendency then to say, well, we've got to have more discipline. We can't have that happen. We've got to watch over them. And it feeds on itself. I think part of the answer is just to try to raise the ethical standards of the individual so that the more the ethics are internalized, so that you're governed by your own internal ethics, the less you have to have it imposed from on high. Like it's sort of like a parent, the more your children actually internalize the ethics you're talking about, you don't have to watch them every day. But if you don't internalize them, that you got to watch every time they go out. I'm afraid they might do something.
So if the leader has a high standard of ethics, he or she, you're saying, probably has to watch a little less.
Well, I'm saying if you've got members that they're liable to go offside, particularly on ethical questions, then that tends to foster more discipline rather than less. And then it's compounded, of course, in our system, where if you have a minority parliament, like I was an opposition leader, and if some of my members went offside, it was bad for the party and our image, but it didn't affect the operation of the parliament or the government.
Right.
But if you got a minority government and you got two members that go off somewhere, they can actually bring down the government or bring its operations to a halt. And so minority government even tightens this apparent need for internal discipline.
Okay. One final question. This is on something a little bit different. I wonder what your feelings are about the idea that the federal government wants to expand the police powers and the role of CSIS's powers to combat terrorism.
Well, it's a difficult issue. It's a difficult issue for Canada. It's an even more difficult issue for the United States. What you're trying to balance is this need for security, which is heightened every time you have an incident. I was in Ottawa that week that there was the incident at the Parliament. I ended up being locked down in the Westin Hotel, which is just a block from or 2 blocks from the War Memorial. So every time you have an incident like that, and of course the Americans had 9/11, the demand for tighter security goes up, tighter surveillance, and people will ask questions, why didn't you find these people in advance? Why didn't somebody know about this guy and head him off the path? So you got all that. But at the other hand, then every measure you do like that tends to circumscribe people's personal liberty. And the challenge for the governing people is to try to find the right balance. I do think there's a bias in the civil servants and the elected people that if they don't practice stringent security and something goes wrong and somebody gets killed, well, then they'll be hammered for why didn't you do more? But in their effort to do more, of course, you can threaten people's liberties.
Do we have the right balance now?
I think we're conscious of the need for the balance, which I think is an important step. Nobody's saying go totally draconian, totalitarian measures. We've not invoked the War Measures Act like Mr. Trudeau did, but he was under extreme pressure to do that. I think there's a consciousness and a need for balance, and I think they're searching for it. I don't know whether you ever get it completely right, but Canada's been relatively fortunate. We've had a few of these incidents, but we haven't had them the way many other countries have had them, and hope and pray that that will remain the case.
All right. Preston Manning, thank you very much for this.
Thank you.